On the chairs, Dana Younger from IFC, Harry Boyd-Carpenter from EBRD, Marcello Sala from Banca Intesa and the Egyptian-Italian Business Council, Bernhard Haider from PwC Middle East, Mario Salameh from the HSBC Bank Middle East, and Theuns Ehlers from the Barclays Africa. We shall do the same as before. There's no PowerPoint, just a talk show. And Paolo Frankl will briefly introduce the topic, and also one by one we will challenge our experts there. So we have about, Paolo, 1 hour or more or less. Okay? Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Yes. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome again. We have the tough task to wake you up after lunch. So we'll try our best in this important panel roundtable on financing. We still miss one person who will come, but nonetheless, I will start. I will introduce my distinguished panelists one by one before asking them the first question, a first round of questions for each of 3 minutes, and then we go to a second round, and then we open the questions to the floor. Now, when I was preparing this myself to ask the question, I was saying, okay, how can we make sure, at what conditions Egypt can be the next Dubai in terms of cost efficiency of solar panels or renewables? And now, of course, after the tenders, this is the wrong question, because Egypt is already the #1 in wind. But nonetheless, the question still holds. What are the conditions that make it happen for the financial sector to invest in scale and at the lowest cost for the consumers? This remains my overarching question that I would like to have to answer at the end of this panelist. Are the instruments the right ones? We have been exposed in the morning to a plurality of measures. Professor Scoppi said we are trying them all. We are making in a trial process, and I would like to have your opinion on that. I will start on my very right with Mr. Dana Younger, the Chief Renewable Energy Specialist at International Finance Corporation. That's the private sector lending arm of the World Bank. I understand that IFC financed more than 2.5 billion in climate-related business last fiscal year, of which 500+ million on renewables. And you are the lead business developer for large-scale-tied renewable energy transactions. Now, my first question is, why the World Bank in the sector? Why is this not ready for the commercial banks alone? And how you see the progress and how you see these recent trends in the area and in Egypt in particular. Dana.
Thank you. Well, first, I want to thank Res Format and Enel for inviting us, and also wish a greeting to all of my good friends from Egypt. Masal khair. Masal ful. It's really wonderful to be among you and to see this tremendous progress which is being made. So I think first we really need to congratulate the government of Egypt for their commitment to the diversification of energy sources and renewables, and realizing this potential. And I have to say, just kind of a personal anecdote, Paolo, in the mid-1980s, I was working in Cairo when the first wind resource assessment studies were being done, and we helped finance some of those studies. And so one of the questions you asked is, why the World Bank? You know, what's our role? And shouldn't we be giving way perhaps to commercial banks and other financial institutions? The reality is the bank group, and I'm sure we'll hear from Harry further from EBRD's perspective, I think plays a very important role in countries in the region, including Egypt, to help support and strengthen the regulatory framework. The government of Egypt is one of our shareholders, as are other governments from within the region. And so we have actually a very active partnership, not just within renewables, but actually spanning the entire energy sector, and quite an active program of work ongoing. I can't go into all the detail of that, but renewables is a very important component of that. The second point really is we've seen the evolution in Egypt over the last several years of some important political and economic activities which unfortunately kind of sent a signal to foreign investors that it was not a good time to invest in Egypt and that perhaps investment would not be secure. And one of the roles that the bank group plays, as do other development finance institutions, is to help offer security to foreign investors, to stand with them and to help give them reassurance, acting either formally through partial risk guarantees or other kinds of political risk mitigation to help in difficult times we remain in these countries, whereas commercial banks will often flee. So that's probably a short response to your question.
Thank you so much. So the second panelist is Mr. Harry Boyd-Carpenter, senior banker in EBRD's Power and Energy Utilities team. And I understand that the EBRD has also been active on the framework preparation of the feed-in tariffs in Egypt. And how do you see that particular tool progressing? What is your expectations? What is coming next? And again, what is the role of EBRD in probably facilitating the coming of the commercial lenders afterwards?
Sure, thank you, Paolo. So, I mean, EBRD, much like IFC, but with just a regional focus, is a development bank with a public mandate. And our mandate is what we call transition. And that means, in our case, the transition from a command economy or to a market economy, from an unsustainable market model to a sustainable market model. And the reason we think we're relevant and the reason we're working in Egypt is because Egypt, in the energy sector, is going through two very big transitions right now. One is what we're talking about in the case of renewables, which is a physical transition, a transition from an energy sector dominated by hydrocarbons to one with a much more diverse fuel mix and a much greater role for renewables. And the other transition alongside that physical transition is a structural transition away from a state-dominated command economy approach, vertically integrated, almost entirely run and controlled by the state, towards a much more liberalized model and a model which has a much greater role for the private sector. And I think it's important not to lose sight of that structural transformation because that's going on at the same time. And renewables is a very big part of that because, of course, the renewables development is being led now by the private sector and will be the vehicle for the introduction of far more diverse, far more private participation in the sector. So there's two big transitions going on. We're a transition bank, and so we hope to play a similar role to the one that Dana described, which is firstly to provide capital, to be willing to lend and to invest for a long time in a situation which remains quite uncertain and where it remains quite hard for commercial banks to take risk. The other side to what we're trying to do is what we call policy dialogue, which is to try and bring the experience we've gained from working on similar transitions in other countries and use that wherever we can to help the Egyptian authorities. So what have we been doing? Well, with Dana's colleagues, we've been, in the IFC, we've been working very closely with the Egyptian authorities to try and put our input into the contractual framework and the regulatory framework to make sure that it's something that works for us, works for investors, and at the same time delivers what is a fair and sensible deal for the Egyptian side. That process has been going on for the last couple of months. I'd like to say something which follows on from what Dana said, which is I've been involved in this process in quite a few different countries. I've never worked with a group of authorities more committed, more open, and more willing to make this process work. I think that what Dr. Sobki and his colleagues in ENRIA and Egyptera and EETC has done is actually remarkable. And I think all of us who've been involved in this have been really impressed by that. So what do I expect? Well, we finished our review last night. We are going to be circulating comments towards the end of this week. We think it's moving on track. What does on track mean? I think I'll be optimistic and say that May is a plausible deadline to have a bankable framework in place. And I think what underlies that is two things. One is the fundamental driver for renewables, what you talked about at the beginning, Paolo, which is renewables make sense for Egypt. This is not driven by some sort of political wishful thinking. This is not driven by some idealistic view that it's nice to have a wind turbine on your show. It's driven by really, really strong fundamentals. That's one reason it's going to happen. And the second reason it's going to happen is what I mentioned, which is this is a really impressive set of government counterparties who are committed to doing this, who are open to the dialogue with developers and lenders. So I think put those two together, and I think we could look at really having projects starting development properly in the summer.
Excellent.
Well, I'm not putting any money on that, obviously.
Okay. Excellent, thank you. So I will go in this order, the sitting order. So I will ask first Mario Salameh, the Managing Director, Head of Project Finance in MENA of HSBC of Frankl Middle East Limited. And I understand that since 2001, Mario has been advising and arranging oil, gas, petrochemicals, power and mining and metals project finance transaction in MENA region. And now you're responsible for the whole business. So my first question is to you, because you come from the conventional sector. Is this shift to renewables real? Is this real business for a commercial bank, or is it a political construct? We already heard some, but I would like to have this input from you. What is your view of the outlook in the coming years, the instruments that the government of Egypt has put in place? And is there a link also with other sector of your investment? So what is the role of renewable in industry and maybe hybridization of renewables with gas?
Yeah, actually, I don't see there is a shift. I don't know why you're referring to a shift, because as a bank, clearly we have been involved in the renewable sector all around the world. What happened in this region of the world, renewable is relatively still a new sector. I mean, you have activities in Morocco, in Jordan, a little bit in Dubai, Abu Dhabi. So it's not yet a well-established sector. So the fact that me personally, kind of most of my activities, as you say, individually and the team in the conventional is a reflection of the reality of the region and the markets. Before I go there, let me give a little bit of kind of background, a little bit on Egypt, project finance, commercial bank involvement. Prior to the revolution, Egypt used to be, for the international commercial bank, the second largest project finance market after Saudi Arabia in the region. We as a bank and our and other banks were active in most sectors: power, oil and gas, petrochemicals, name it. So one of the advantages that we have in Egypt is that there is a good culture of project financing. And if you look at the local banks, there are good bankers still there in the local banks who have a high quality experience in project financing. They don't have renewable experience, but they have very solid project financing experience, which is a positive. The other thing positive is today, although there was a reduction in the oil price, there is still a lot of liquidity in the regional project finance market. That liquidity is concentrated in few countries, mainly GCC countries. Because so much liquidity concentrated in the small number of countries, clearly the banks are not making enough return and money from those investments. So the banks, this is a good time, are really looking at new markets. Now, Egypt is not new, but since the revolution, other than one deal, which is the Egyptian refining company, which was a legacy deal that dragged till 2012, there haven't been any major project financing in Egypt. So let me speak it. So what the international banks are doing, they are returning back to the market. In my view, there's an important role for IFC and EBRD to play, especially in the first years of the market returning back Egypt. They have a major leading role to play, because understandably, although me personally as a business person, I'm extremely hungry and eager on Egypt, organizations and credit departments will take time before they write 20-year, for example, clean commercial financing to Egypt. They will need time. It will happen step by step. The first few projects, maybe you will have IFC, EBRD, local banks, and the international banks under certain cover, ECA, MEGA, whatever. Then gradually they will take more exposure. There will be a sweet-sour ratio. In 2 or 3 years' time, my expectation, assuming there will be continuation of the political and security situation will continue to improve, I expect the market to become like the old years of 2007 and 6 and 4. All the international banks will be there and be writing checks. And I agree, with Harry's point about renewable sector, because of a number of factors discussed earlier during those sessions. I don't want to repeat them. They stop to become a project that only survive on subsidies because of policies of government. It seems they are more and more becoming viable on their own right. And this is a key credit point that we do. When we look at the projects, we ask 2 main questions. Number 1, who are the developers? Are they credible enough to do the project? But number 2 is, are the project viable on their own right? Can they survive good times and bad times? So yes, we're looking closely at the renewable sector in Egypt. However, to be clear on a point, we have a preference towards IPP, competitive bidding projects, versus negotiated projects or feed-in tariff, for obvious reasons that have been discussed also previously on the panel.
Thank you. Can I ask you back, but you were working more on feed-in tariffs, EBRD, right?
We've been involved in both the IPPs and feed-in tariffs. Okay. So I think most of our efforts have been on the feed-in tariff because, frankly, we came to that at a point where it was still quite early in the development, and there was probably more need, more scope for our involvement and support. We have also given some input on the IPPs.
We've been involved in the again the feed-in tariff more recently, but the World Bank was heavily involved in advising the government of Egypt on setting up the wind IPP program, and IFC had the experience of financing thermal IPP projects previously in Egypt as well. So
I will return back on a question on that, but before I would like to introduce the first Italian bank in this panel, a very leading bank. Marcello Sala is Executive Vice Chairman of Intesa Sanpaolo Management Board since 2010 and the board member since the bank was established in 2007. But you have also a very peculiar role with relation to Egypt, I understand, and with a very profound knowledge as former vice chairman of Alex Bank, but also the Italian chairman of the Italian-Egyptian Business Council. So you are a profound knowledge here. So from your perspective, can we now shift a little bit on the risk side? Because the opportunity side is pretty clear and the fundamentals is there. Yeah. This has been widely debated. But the devil is in the details, as always. Where do you see the risk? How you manage them as a commercial banker? And what are the plans of the bank in this area in the coming years?
Well, before to go to the risks, let me thank once again ResFOMED and the Egyptian friends for this event today, because as you said before, as a chairman of the Italian-Egyptian Business Council, this is just another chance to highlight the good relations between the two countries, between the two business communities, and especially to highlight a sector, I mean the renewable, where Italy has a leadership that is not well known outside Italy, but Italy with Spain and Germany is among the countries where there is a big, large market for renewables. And well, because of this, being the largest bank in Italy, we have been involved and we are involved in this sector, not only in Italy but also outside. And of course, having the subsidiary in Egypt, Alex Bank, that by chance we did not leave during the revolution. We are, I think, in a very good position. First of all, to evaluate what's going on this in this sector and in Egypt, and then eventually to participate in the financing of the projects. Well, the risks we see are Well, first of all, I fully agree with the foreseeable development of the market. I mean, this market starting from mostly DFI and government, then to a portion for private commercial banks, and then hopefully to a full engagement from the commercial banks. But even now, some risks that are peculiar to Egypt or to emerging countries, let's say, are well identified. I just want to mention a couple of these. Well, first is the currency risk. You know that under the legislation that was released last year, payments are supposed to be in Egyptian pounds. So it's very technical, and this is another role we have being Italian with the experience in renewable, but also Egyptian. We would like to give advices to our friends. You know that the recent bond market for pounds, and so you cannot use derivatives to cover your currency risk in Egypt. So this is something we have to work on, and we are already working to work out this. And so the currency risk. The other one is the political risk. Because you know, we are not here in a situation where you have 20, 30 years of stability, rule of law, all these kind of things that are necessary to fully develop a market like the renewables that are based also on a kind of government guarantee. So these are the two most important risks I see. There are others, but I think that later on in the panel we can also touch upon these other risks.
Okay, so going to the third commercial private bank, we have the pleasure to have Theuns Ehlers, I hope I pronounce this in the right way, Managing and Principal Head for Resource and Project Finance in Barclays, Africa. And what intrigued me reading your CV was you also were involved for many years in oil, gas, gold, platinum, copper, coal, mineral sands, diamonds. So my first question is whether you see the renewables, the new diamonds for Africa in general and for Egypt. And the second, more serious, you were involved a lot in the experience in South Africa. What kind of lessons do you think you can learn from that country where you can give advice and see progress in Egypt?
Thanks a lot. I don't think you can be a South African-based bank. Barclays obviously owns the Absa brand in South Africa, where I'm based in Johannesburg, and not finance mining deals. Johannesburg as a city is basically based on the gold rush. So we've done as a bank lots of financings across the commodity sectors. But I do believe if you look at the current commodity cycle, renewable energy is probably the new diamonds that we will be mining for the future. Good. So we've been active, and so just to maybe a bit of background, which I'd like to share, and maybe after the successful bid for your wind deals, maybe we need to learn from Egypt. But just to share with you, you know, some of the experiences we've had in South Africa with our renewable program. You know, up until probably 3-4 years ago, we didn't have a program. We didn't have IPPs in South Africa. Every single bit of generation capacity was owned effectively by the state through our utility Eskom. And 95% of those are coal-based power stations. So really, there was no market for the banks basically to come in and provide financing because Eskom raised most of its funding on the capital markets. So when the program started, I think one of the key things for us is they've isolated what we used to have a PPP unit, we still do, isolated a small task team to go start and run this process, and basically created this IPP office. And one of the first things they've done was basically to consult very widely with all private sector participants. So they spoke to the sponsors, they spoke to the RPP investors, they spoke to the banks. They got international consultants around to look at all the experiences in Europe specifically as well, before they finalized the regulatory framework and the way they were going to go about procuring this. So in that exercise, when the program eventually was launched to the market, it was imminently bankable. It was launched on the basis that they weren't going to entertain any further negotiation on commercial terms where it relates to the government framework. And you know, on that basis, it cuts out a lot of negotiation time down the line. If you know that the package is set in stone, and then you can focus on the real issues, which is negotiating a proper EPC, O&M, getting your cash flows and things right, because you knew that the government framework was totally bankable. Also, I think as part of that process, you know, some of the key issues from a risk perspective, which have been addressed early on, is things like FX risk. In South Africa, the tariffs are all in rands, so effectively the funding, the markets are fairly deep, so the funding is all in rands. But simple things like, you know, who takes risk of currency movements in the procurement of equipment between bid date and close? And government basically said, you know, they're happy to make those adjustments because our currency is quite volatile. So the bid date, or the rate at which you bid on bid date, will be adjusted for FX movements between bid and close. You know, things like that assisted tremendously. Also, you know, issues around the grid. You know, our grid was never properly developed to cater for all this new renewable energy. And by basically taking that risk away from the RPPs and saying that, you know, those risks will remain with the utility, it provided the RPPs with a lot of comfort. Just one final comment on the process. They did change it after the first bidding round. You know, our first bidding round was basically a feed-in tariff regime where they set the tariff levels. From the second round onwards, they changed that to an auction competitive process. And immediately what happened was, as you can imagine, the tariffs which they were able to obtain in the market reduced significantly. You know, to such an extent, you know, I think there's been close to a 40 to a 50% drop in our wind tariffs and the PV tariffs even more. And I think all of that was based, and I think it was strategically done that way. The first round was intentionally quite friendly to investors and sponsors. And once we knew the program worked, the deals actually got to close, they then went into second gear, which was making this all a more competitive exercise. That's where I will stop for now. Thanks.
Excellent. So our last panelist is Bernhard Haider, partner of PricewaterhouseCoopers Middle East. And you are responsible for lead infrastructure finance in Levant and North Africa and the power sector for the whole Middle East. Now, you have the overview on the whole area, also across policy measures, across investors. What is your view in terms of what is really new and peculiar in Egypt on a positive side? And at the same time, I have to say, when I heard this morning presentation, the measures that are on the plate now are rather complex. So is there a need for a simplification? Which one of these measures, feed-in tariffs versus auctions, will prevail? What are the pros and cons from your perspective?
Okay. Thank you also, first of all, to RES format for the invitation. And yeah, what you just raised and the question you raised, if you look in the Middle East region and compare what happened in Egypt, if you compare what happened in the Middle East region and what happened especially the last year in Egypt, first of all, you see that Egypt, and I think Harry or Mario mentioned it already, Egypt has some track record from the past. Egypt was not a country which had to invent the wheel from scratch. Your first wheel was many thousand years ago already invented, but no, also if you talk about project finance, PPP project, BO project, Egypt was the first country who had a PPP law, a PPP unit, delivered projects as PPP project before the revolution already. And so there's a track record there. Second, what I noticed the last years, and especially the last year, you even can say the last month, Egypt is a fast learning country. And you didn't make the failures other countries made in the region. And I don't want to name countries, but you have countries in Middle East who launched, for example, renewable programs 5 years ago. And they started slowly now to deliver. Egypt launched programs and delivers. So, and you put the proper framework in place, or Egypt put the proper framework in place from the legal point of view, regulatory framework. On the other hand, and this is challenges, and I think what you're mentioning as well, asking as well, that's what I see advising our clients, but also working for the government. You have very good intentions in Egypt on top level of all the institutions. Very well-skilled people, good intentions, good experience. But if it goes down to the second and third layer, and even I think President Al-Sisi mentioned it in Sharm el-Sheikh, you have to push this knowledge and willingness to implement these programs down to the second and third layer, which is a very, very important step Egypt has to go for. Also, on the other hand, if you look now at the feed-in tariff scheme and compare it with the competitive auction scheme, simple answer is, from my point of view, that the direction should go, and also the results show it, into the competitive auctions scheme. It's straightforward, very transparent. It's easier also for the banks to finance it, so it's easier to create a bankable case. The feed-in tariff scheme at the moment is very attractive to a lot of developers, and it's like sitting next to someone of South Africa. It's like the gold rush at the moment. Each and everyone who has even had nothing to do in the past with renewables wants to step into this market now and develop renewable projects because they seem to be so attractive. But it turns out quite soon that's also a very complex and complicated process. And also, look at Dr. Sopke, it's also a learning process on the other side, because now suddenly you're challenged by international lawyers and banks and so on the nitty-gritty details, and this takes some time, and I don't think that it will be delivered in a very fast manner compared to the competitive bids. So this, from my point of view, is the future.
Okay, I will ask one other question on that, but before I would like to introduce a second round of questions that were provided by email from stakeholders, and there are around 3 themes basically. One is affordability, the second is certainty, and the third is complexity, and the 2 last are political risk, so which is perceived obviously as the one major one. But I would start from the affordability, because nobody touched this too much this morning. I have 2 questions here. First, it was asked, any contradiction, do you see any contradiction between the transition from fossil fuel subsidies and to offer extra market incentives to renewables? Isn't that a contradiction from a banking point of view? And how will this reflect, A, on the state budget? Can Egypt afford that? And the second, can consumer afford that, the very impressive extra investments in renewables? What do you have an opinion on here? Who wants to, how do you see that?
Shall I?
Please.
it's a very important question, potentially one of the most important questions. One thing that's important to us at EBRD is that we don't just work for private sector, so we work for public sector. And the first deal we've done in the Egyptian power sector since we started operating is a sovereign loan to fund the upgrade of open cycle to combined cycle. Now, that's a good project in itself, but one of the things we did as part of it is we said we've got to understand the finances and the economics of our ultimate borrower, the Egyptian electricity holding company. And we've built a model of their finances. Now, that is not an easy job, and I can't pretend that it's the most accurate model in the world because their finances are very, very difficult to understand, to put it mildly. But what we focused on is what does it really cost to generate power in Egypt? Because you cannot in Egypt look at the end user tariffs and compare them to the cost of renewables because there is a broken transmission mechanism. As we all know, the subsidies are enormous. It depends how you value it, but my view is you take any figure the IMF gives for subsidies and then add at least 50% to capture all of the implicit subsidies. There are even some stories that e-gas doesn't always get paid on time for its gas. I don't know if Dr. Shoaib has any view on that. But so the correct comparison is never between the cost of renewables and the end user tariff. Okay. The end user tariff is not in any way an accurate price signal about anything. And the real question is, what's the cost of renewables compared to the marginal, or possibly the average cost of power for Egypt or for the Egyptian electricity holding company? And our view is actually, especially when you talk about the sorts of figures that came out this morning, there isn't a subsidy. And I think that's the big difference. Renewable energy in Egypt looks expensive compared to end user tariff. It probably looks expensive compared to wholesale power if you can buy gas at $3 per MMBTU and you don't worry about a host of other costs that you're not recovering. But fundamentally, if you look at the true wholesale cost of power in Egypt, renewables are not subsidized, they're genuinely competitive. So I actually think renewables in the long run is a bonus for affordability in Egypt.
Okay. Anyone else wants to comment? My point is that if the affordability question is not solved, then immediately you may have risk of retroactive actions that maybe a new government says, oh no, this is a crazy idea. We have seen a lot of these stories in Europe.
Yeah, starting from a story in Europe, I would say that it's not a matter of, or it's not completely a matter of affordability, but the risk that now you associate with affordability. I try to explain. Affordability is a relative term because to pay for subsidies or tariffs or call it whatever you want, you can raise taxes or cut expenses to find money to afford this political choice. Because at the end of the day, this is a political choice. What we did in Italy, we went out the nuclear, and it was very popular to finance, to subsidize renewables, so we did. Then after some years, the crisis came. So it was not popular anymore to make customers to pay to finance renewables. So they decided to change to lower these subsidies. So at the end of the day, now, this kind of risk, I mean the risk that at one time government can change idea, is taken into the risks and so into the cost of the projects. What is not into these costs, in Italy and in Europe? Then, after 10 years, a new government come and not only say, look, I changed idea about to subsidize or not renewables, but I say that contract is not legal anymore. So I completely erase the agreement. So it's quite different. This is what I call the political risks that I mentioned before. But I think these are two different risks.
But how do you cover from your second risk? Is there any way? You just risk.
Not fully, of course, but you can involve the ECA, the export credit agencies to try to enhance your guarantees. This is a way, or to link as This is very interesting what Egypt did to link, the sovereign default with the respect of these agreements, because if I'm not wrong, for projects over 20 megawatt, there is a kind of option. If the agency doesn't pay, then it's transformed automatically into a sovereign debt. So you linked the sovereign risk with the project risk. That is, in theory, this is an enhancement, because you are supposed to first to default on a single project, then after, at the end, default on a sovereign level. So this is another way. But
I think the main thing you do to reduce the risk of renegotiation or reopening of the contract is that you go through a competitive process, an open tender that ensure at that moment of time you get the best price, which in my view is better than feed-in tariff where the price is fixed. Because at the price is fixed, there's always someone who will come and challenge that price is rich. In a competitive process where the best players in the world are competing against each other, whoever wins, this is really the fair price at that moment of time. I think, and that's why our preference for the competitive versus the feed-in tariff.
Please.
In South Africa, we sat with the same issue. So what we've done, we've obviously seen what happened in Italy and elsewhere. So in the event that our contracts is changed and government comes and basically wants to change the tariff, it results in a potential trigger the termination of the contract, which means they will have to buy out, pay both debt and equity. So there's a legal mechanism that we found to actually deal with a specific scenario. But I mean, that still, I suppose, doesn't prevent him from still trying to disregard the contract altogether. So I would agree, rather go for a competitive exercise and make sure that the tariffs are the best at the time. But I think the lawyers tell us there's a legal way to also get around this.
How the South African have done, as you said, from round 2 is a good combination.
Exactly.
Where the feed-in tariff with a cap and people bid in every round.
Yeah.
And you can be sure with the competition that the clearing price or the winning price is, I think, always below the cap. Yeah?
Yes,
material below the
correct.
cap.
So if you look at the feed-in tariff scheme at the moment, I think, as mentioned several times now, that the biggest concern of each investor is where will it go in the future, because you have the benchmark coming out from competitive bids. Then you have the mechanism that you're allowed to change in a couple of years, the feed-in tariff. And on the other hand, it's also a question, because in parallel, and Paolo mentioned it at the beginning, you have an institutional change in the whole electricity sector in Egypt. So they will build a completely new market structure, market rules, and market setup, and where will it lead? So having the uncertainty on the future feed-in tariff scheme, have the uncertainty on the new market rules, maybe liberalized market and so on, removal of subsidies, so a lot of uncertain factors and parameters in the game, and coming back, a competitive bid is the most preferable in this environment.
Okay, I will have one question from my side on that. But before, I would like to open the floor for questions. You want to make a comment, Professor Otsopkin, please. This is what I was expecting.
Well, I'd like to comment on the affordability thing.
Thank
and
you.
Especially when we went through the tariff reform for all the sectors, that was based on not only on cost recovery over the 5 years and removing subsidies within the constraint of the fuel supply prices, but also it went on based on some statistical analysis which is conducted biannually by the Central Office of Statistics in Egypt, which shows the level of expenditure of the different end users, especially the residential, on energy and on electricity specifically. And in doing the reform, we found that it is the level of expenditure is less than 2% of the level of on electricity as compared to the overall expenditure, and that normally when that was compared with sort of international norms, we found that that number can go up to 4%. So that guided us in doing the tariff reform, so not to exceed the 4% after 5 years, and also to the lifeline customers that not to exceed the 2% after the 5 years. So that was one of the constraints which we worked on, as well as to recover the cost after 5 years. Now, when introducing renewables, and if we think that this 4,000 or 5,000 megawatts is an appreciable percentage, it will only present somewhere between around 4 to 5% in our electricity energy mix by year 2022. So, and that will reflect, it will reflect about 4 to 5% of the electricity bill to end users. And if the cost of renewables even is higher than the conventional, that will not exceed somewhere around maybe 9 to 10% of the bill at the end of the day. So the affordability part is taken into consideration when addressing the issue of the pricing and sending the right signal to the end users. Of course, with the bidding process, which numbers were announced, that goes more into the favor that prices or end user payments will be quite affordable.
Since you have the mic, I profit to ask this question. Of course, and I should first state, at the IEA, we are always in favor of competition and open market. But when you compare auctions to the feed-in tariffs, you also have to have in mind what kind of competition you want. Don't you see a risk with it auction only? You will only have the usual suspects of international players, with Enel being, of course, one of them. What kind of competition do you really want in Egypt? Is this something that you are considering? And this question is also to you, of course.
What you can do is true, there are a number of players. I mean, a few things. In the renewable sector, the industry is more fragmented than the conventional business. So you don't have the same risk of concentration. Even in certain countries where they had a concentration risk, they put rules that above a certain X% of generation, if you have more than that percent, you cannot bid anymore for a number of projects. So you can control the concentration risk. But I don't believe in renewable, actually in renewable, especially in solar more than wind, as we have seen in recent projects. Actually, the market is very fragmented. Yeah, so I don't think you have this issue of concentration risk if you go through the IPP model.
Anyone else want to comment on that? If not,
I suppose there are pros and cons. We've seen the likes of Enel being very successful in South Africa. But ultimately, it's not only about that. I mean, the government also have local development objectives. So there's a requirement for local sourcing. So it's clearly not only the IPP who benefits from the exercise. Ultimately, the consumers will benefit because the tariffs are very competitive. And there's still a good distribution, even with the auction process, between the key participants in the program.
But you have very strong local contents that they don't like always. I'm looking at the developers now.
Yeah, look, the local content issue, I mean, for most African countries still in growth phase, it's important to establish local manufacturing capacity, local skills on the ground. And I think over time, you'd like more of the actual manufacturing bits and pieces to also take place closer to the end markets. And we've seen it working and also being able to be competitive. It stimulates, and especially for countries like South Africa, local job creation, which is absolutely critical for economic development as well.
Any other question from the floor, please? Please. The lady over there, Katrina.
My name is Katarina Ringborg. I represent the North African Chamber of Commerce in Stockholm. I have a question to the IFC and the EBRD. The UN Green Climate Fund is now starting to become operational after many years of hard work since Copenhagen in 2009. And my question to you is, how do you see what could they contribute? What could they do in the coming years, realistically?
You're right. The Green Climate Fund is now operational, and I think they're eager to participate in projects in this region. The woman who's the executive director actually has the history of having worked in the African Development Bank, Hela, in this region for some time, so she's quite familiar with it. And my understanding is they're already considering a number of projects in the region for participation, just like other concessional financing sources like the Clean Technology Fund of the Climate Investment Funds and even the GEF, which is still active, are participating. So very clearly, I think there will be a role.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Dan is the guru on this topic, but I think generally, I mean, our view on these funds is that they have to be catalytic. Given the amount of money available, although the numbers look big, they're small compared to the scale of investment required. And it's also very important to the donors that they catalyze further investments. I think we've seen two roles for these funds fundamentally. One is to do projects that are first of a kind, particularly challenging, things that require proof of concept. The other is enabling infrastructure. And that can be both soft infrastructure, which is capacity building up resource of the teams, of the institutions on the ground, and the other is hard infrastructure. Whether it's SCADA systems to help manage networks better, whether it's transmission investments. So I think in certainly the sort of applications that we've put into these funds, and we have one, we've already put together a donor-funded program for renewable energy, private renewable energy in North Africa using Clean Technology Fund and Global Environmental Facility Fund. What we've focused on is those sorts of applications of this money, not to fund projects that are going to happen anyway, but to fund things where you're trying to prove that prove a model can work, or where you're going to fund some sort of enabling investment that will in turn allow much more investment to come. So I think that's the niche that you will find those funds most effectively deployed in.
Thank you very much. Other question from the floor? We didn't always manage to wake them up. I have one specific question on one of the risks that was mentioned, that is access to the grid. So it's unclear to me, if the developers made a project and then the connection is not ready yet, who pays? And how are you assessing with the risk? And correlated question, how much of your investment portfolios is in energy transmission? How do you help the Egyptian government and the whole system to go in parallel? As it was rightly said this morning, it's important to develop renewable resources in parallel with the infrastructures. Are you active in that as well? Is it a risk mitigation strategy? Who wants to?
I mean, I can talk about the risk because I just read the PPA
Please.
Yesterday. So and the network connection contract. I mean, legally, it's the off-taker risk.
Okay.
So it's not the project risk. I mean, the structures of the project documents for the renewable program are pretty recognizable, conventional, take or pay.
Take or pay, okay.
Risk allocation legally. Now, it's also true, as Theuns mentioned, it's all very well relying on a legal agreement, but I mean, in my previous life, I was a lawyer, and I saw plenty of legal agreements get chucked out the window. So it's a very important issue. I think it's a very important issue in Egypt that people will want to know.
Yes.
Especially for the INRAE projects, you've got massive single point. I mean, you've got, I think, 1.8 gigawatts of solar connecting in one location. So no one is going to, well, certainly we aren't going to invest in that, just in reliance on a beautifully drafted PPA.
Just to complement what Harry said, the World Bank does have some commitments to financing transmission infrastructure in Egypt. Also, the sector, as was noted, is under reform. We have a history of working in other countries in the world where private or quasi-private entities are involved in transmission to be involved directly as IFC in their financing. And clearly there are important grid integration and grid access questions tied intimately into every aspect of the rapid, dramatic growth of renewables and their scaling in Egypt. So these are important topics that are going to have to be managed carefully across the private investors, the public sector participants, and governments and financing institutions.
Yeah, for most of the countries, transmission network is seen as strategic national assets. So that's why rarely they are privatized. And on that basis, rarely commercial banks finance transmission companies or transmission entities. Of course, it's not the case for generation and distribution, which tend to be privatized. So rarely there have been any kind of investment directly from the banks on a project finance basis in transmission network.
But I mean, I like the assessment that was done, that according to the project that exists now, there may be concentration issues. So will you invest in this, or what do you do?
What Haider said, a very important point. That's why what I stressed, I said viability of a project.
Okay.
It means the project has to be technically and commercially viable, even without looking at any contract. Because you can have a beautiful contract and the project, if there's a problem in transmission, a serious one, what will happen in real life, most likely, the procurer or the off-taker will call you and say, let's sit down, try to find a solution. So, of course, so it's part of the viability. So this is called the technical viability.
Well,
so
probably the best example of where this hasn't worked well to date has been in China, where there's been an enormous concentration of wind, for example, in Inner Mongolia, and then forced curtailment because the wind is blowing steadily at night. Suddenly the transmission lines are not able to evacuate all the power, and so levels of curtailment are extremely high. So these are the kinds of questions that have to be managed very carefully, because, you know, the profile of renewables is going to be quite known and quite well understood, and once you begin to concentrate development in certain areas, then that may create other issues. The other point I wanted to just note in closing is I think there's some learning that Egypt may benefit from other countries that have moved down this path more quickly. For example, Brazil, when they introduced the Pro-Infra program, they were able to allocate capacity across technologies. And I understand that solar PV under the feed-in tariff has sort of been oversubscribed, whereas wind is likely to be undersubscribed. So I'm wondering, Dr. Opsopki, whether any thought has been given to allocating the unused portion of wind initially, for example, into solar PV to be able to satisfy more of the pre-qualified companies. So that's just one interesting.
Please. Can you give Professor Opsopki the mic? Thanks.
Yes, there is an oversubscription in the PV thing, but just recently now, we sort of reached the number of applicants, successful applicants for the wind, have just barely covering the target of the 2,000 megawatts. So a shift between the two is not there. But we are further studying the development of other projects, not within the feed-in tariff. Another parallel scheme, totally different than the ones I showed this morning, for larger size projects in areas where the wind regime is not as attractive as in the order of 7 or 8 meters per second as compared to 10 and 11 meters per second in different areas in the country. And that's in a way to diversify the resources, to diversify the geographical location of the resources, to overcome the intermittency issues and so on. And speaking about the network, which is like the strengthening of that, again, yes, it is the off-taker responsibility, and this is why the government of Egypt did put the 3 billion Egyptian pound without waiting for any finance in order to strengthen the network itself. And in meeting the requirements for the projects of the feed-in tariff, even though the announced feed-in tariff puts the responsibility of connecting to the grid on the developer, we opted to let the developers pay for it, but the ones who is going to execute that is the off-taker, it's the main transmission network, in order to assure the time frame needed. So when the developers are ready to inject, the interconnections are there. These are my comments.
Excellent. Thank you so much. You wanted still to comment, if I'm...
No, just also answering the question that a lot of the developers now shortlisted under the feed-in tariff regime see the grid connection still as a risk. So at the political risk, currency risk, the feed-in tariff consistency. And yeah, it's clear that the off-taker should take the risk. But at the end of the day, we don't know the final contracts, and I heard in May they should be issued. So each and everyone wants to see how it is stated in the contract, and not only what's written down in contracts, how it works out in reality. So it's considered still as a risk, and a major risk for all the developers.
Okay. Last attempt to have a question from the floor, please. The gentleman there.
Yes, I think my vote. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Noor Musa, Desert Technologies. So obviously there's a race to the finish line, and especially within the PV segment, where the current mechanism or legislation says, well, the first 2,000 megawatts of PV is locked in, and then the rest will actually follow to the second round to follow. Now, is there any mechanisms or suggestions from the panel to, obviously we spoke to the DFIs, and especially on so the DFIs don't want to take that risk, developers don't want to take that risk. How do we, any suggestions from the panel?
Why do you see why DFIs they don't want to take the risk? Probably the first question should be. Yeah.
Well, I mean, what Noor's referring to, I mean, this was for those who were in Cairo a couple of weeks ago. This was discussed extensively. What Noor's referring to is the question of when is your tariff fixed?
Yes.
And the question is it at the beginning of a development process, which exposes the Egyptian authorities to the risk that people fall out and they don't deliver the 4 gigawatts certainly and quickly, which is absolutely key for them? Or do you fix it at the end of the process, i.e. when you get to financial close, which exposes the developers to the risk that they spend a lot of money and end up being the 2050th megawatt or 2001th megawatt, which then doesn't get the tariff? Well, why don't DFIs want to take this risk? I mean, I don't think any lender particularly takes development risk. We'll take it against a balance sheet, no problem, no. But I don't have a lot to add to the extensive conversations we had on this. I mean, I think it's a policy decision, judgment, not a bankability issue.
Okay, I understand that our time is over perfectly with 1 minute close, Italian precision. I please, with me, give an applause to our panelists for a very good panel. My understanding, I see more positive lights, despite some risk are there, that's obvious, but I hear a very positive and optimist story here. Thank you so much for waking up the audience in the afternoon. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Thank you.